There are moments in the life of the church when silence becomes impossible, when the quiet endurance of the faithful reaches its limit, and a single voice rises to pierce the fog of confusion with the clarity of conviction. This week, that voice was Cardinal Gerhard Müller, the former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, a man whose name has long been synonymous with theological precision and unwavering fidelity, and whose words, spoken in a recent interview, are now echoing through sacristies and seminaries, like the toll of a distant bell, warning of a storm approaching from within. It was not a press statement drafted by cautious advisors, nor a sanitized address to avoid controversy, but an unguarded conversation broadcast on EWTN, where Müller spoke with the kind of frankness that no longer feels common in ecclesiastical circles. His voice, calm, yet edged with the sorrow of a man watching the foundations of his faith tremble under the pressure of modernity. He did not speak as a dissident, nor as a rebel, but as a theologian burdened by conscience, a shepherd who feels the weight of seeing truth negotiated away in the name of relevance. And as he began to unravel his thoughts on the traditional Latin Mass, on modernism, and on the silent war for the soul of the Church, it became clear that this was more than an interview. It was a confession of pain, a warning, and perhaps a plea for remembrance. Müller began by recounting something that, even spoken softly, fell like a stone into still water, that he had received messages from certain bishops suggesting that those faithful who could not accept the new liturgical form born from the reforms of the Second Vatican Council should simply stay at home or join the Lefebvrists, a statement that, if true, exposes the raw nerve running through today's Catholicism. For it is one thing to encourage unity in worship, but another to exile an entire generation of believers whose only fault is fidelity to the Mass that nourished saints and martyrs for centuries, whose Latin syllables once carried the prayers of millions through plague and war. For Müller, this was not nostalgia, it was inheritance, a sacred continuity of reverence that cannot be legislated away without wounding the living body of the Church itself. He warned that the faithful devoted to the ancient rite were not relics to be tolerated, but hearts still beating with love for something eternal, and that by dismissing them as divisive, the Church risked amputating one of its own limbs in an attempt to appear modern. True unity, he said, can never be built on the ruins of memory, and no reform, however noble, can demand the erasure of what was once holy. As the conversation deepened, Cardinal Müller's tone grew more solemn, the cadence of his words carrying the weight of someone who has witnessed too many compromises made in the name of dialogue, too many truths diluted until they lost their power to save, and in that still room, he spoke not of politics or policy, but of the very essence of the Church's soul, its relationship with truth itself, a truth that, he reminded, is not a concept to be adapted, but a person to be encountered, Christ himself, who does not evolve with time nor yield to the moods of history. And yet, Müller lamented, in this new age of confusion, the temptation has returned, the same old seduction that first whispered in the garden, that man could redefine what God had already spoken. He recalled the early Church Fathers, those first theologians who stood firm against the glittering idols of the Greco-Roman world, who recognized a few seeds of truth within pagan philosophy, but never accepted the gods of Olympus as equals to the crucified one. And he warned that today's Church, in its eagerness to be inclusive, risks repeating the very mistake those fathers fought to correct, building a modern pantheon where all religions are treated as equally valid, as if the revelation of Christ were just one lamp among many flickering in the darkness. He spoke with sorrow of a theology that now dares to call relativism a virtue, that bends the gospel to fit the language of social peace and coexistence. And he asked a question that hung heavy in the air: how can there be unity when truth itself is treated as negotiable? Müller insisted that the Church cannot imitate the syncretism of the ancient world, cannot build temples of dialogue where the cross is reduced to a symbol among others, for to do so is to betray her mission, to forget that the apostles did not die for tolerance but for truth. And then, with a voice that seemed to carry both fire and grief, He said that the gospel was never meant to please the world, but to convert it, never meant to comfort the proud, but to save the lost, and that the cost of such fidelity has always been persecution, not applause. He drew a line, invisible yet unmistakable, between the faith that transforms and the faith that conforms, and he urged the faithful to remember that charity without truth becomes sentimentality, and truth without charity becomes cruelty, but that together they form the only language the Church is meant to speak. It was in that moment that the air itself seemed to still, for behind Müller's careful reasoning, there was the unmistakable ache of a man who loves the Church too deeply to flatter her, who fears that beneath the gilded phrases of modernization lies a slow surrender, the quiet corrosion of conviction disguised as compassion. As the interview went on, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if even the cameras understood that something sacred was being unburdened. And when Cardinal Müller turned to speak about the notion of universal brotherhood, his expression carried the calm resolve of a man preparing to touch a wound that still bleeds. For this, he said, was one of the most dangerous illusions of our time. The idea that all men are brothers, regardless of faith, creed, or the truth that binds them. His words were not born from arrogance, but from a fierce sense of clarity, for he reminded the audience that, while every human being is indeed a creature of God, true brotherhood, the kind sanctified by grace, exists only in Christ, only within that communion of souls redeemed by the cross, because without the Redeemer, fraternity becomes a hollow sentiment, a political slogan dressed in the robes of mercy. He spoke slowly, as though each syllable had been weighed against centuries of doctrine, explaining that religions do not share the same understanding of peace, freedom, or human dignity, that these words, so easily printed in declarations and speeches, carry entirely different meanings depending on the God one worships, and that, to pretend otherwise, is to build peace upon illusion. The Church, Müller warned, must never surrender the distinctiveness of its revelation for the comfort of belonging to a global chorus of moral voices, because a peace that denies the truth is not peace but paralysis. A brotherhood without Christ is not unity, but confusion. At this point, his voice lowered, and he said the words that would soon echo far beyond that interview: "We are not all brothers." The silence that followed felt like a wound opening in real time, because it was not hatred that spoke through him, but a warning, the warning of a shepherd who knows that if every faith is treated as equal, then the cross becomes unnecessary, salvation becomes optional, and God himself becomes just another opinion. In a world intoxicated by relativism, Müller's words struck like a cold wind through a cathedral, reminding those who listened that Christianity is not one philosophy among many, but the revelation of the living God, and that to reduce it to a human project of harmony is to drain it of its divine heartbeat. He called it what it is: a drift toward religious naturalism, a polite atheism, cloaked in the language of compassion, where God is invoked not to convert hearts, but to legitimize coexistence without truth. The Church, he insisted, was not founded to be one religion among many, but the vessel of salvation for all. It cannot enter into treaties with error without betraying the blood that built it. And for those who feared that such clarity was harsh, Müller offered a final reminder that true mercy does not mean affirming every path, but calling every soul back to the one road that leads to eternal life, the narrow road once walked by saints who preferred the gallows to compromise. When the subject turned toward the ordination of women, a question that has for decades smoldered like incense over the altar of modern debate, Cardinal Müller straightened slightly, his eyes steady, and the air in the studio seemed to tighten with the awareness that every word to follow would carry the weight of scandal for some and the ring of revelation for others. Yet he spoke without hesitation, his tone neither defiant nor apologetic, but deeply rooted in the serenity of conviction, saying that it is contrary to the Catholic faith to imagine that, at any future time, women might receive the sacrament of holy orders, for this is not an area open to reform or reinterpretation, but one sealed by divine institution itself. Christ, he said, chose men as apostles not because of cultural customs or social hierarchies, but because he willed it so, and the Church, bound to that will, has no authority to rewrite what has been eternally decreed. His words were not meant to diminish the dignity of women, but to protect the sacred logic of the sacraments, to defend the mysterious harmony between symbol and reality that God himself established, and Müller spoke of that harmony as one who sees in it the heartbeat of divine order, the masculine call to priesthood, and the feminine vocation to bring forth life, both physical and spiritual, each reflecting the complementarity of creation rather than competition within it. Equality, he said, cannot mean sameness, for sameness erases the beauty of design, and to force the priesthood into the mold of modern egalitarianism would not elevate women, but impoverish the sacrament itself, reducing what is holy to what is merely functional. He reminded his listeners that the Church is not the master of the sacraments, but their guardian, and that to alter the nature of holy orders would be to sever the apostolic line, stretching unbroken from Christ to Peter to every priest who has since offered the Mass. The ordination of women, he warned, would not be renewal but rupture, a break in the living chain of grace upon which the entire structure of the Church stands. For Müller, the question was not about power or inclusion, but about fidelity. Fidelity to Christ's own example, fidelity to the mystery of divine intention that transcends human trends. He spoke too of the danger of turning the priesthood into a mere social function, a role to be distributed rather than a vocation to be received, and in that critique there was sorrow, more than condemnation, as if he mourned the slow erosion of the sacred into the administrative, the transformation of the altar into a platform for activism. The priest, he said, is not a symbol of human equality, but a vessel of divine grace. And grace cannot be legislated or demanded, it must be received with humility. To speak of the priesthood in purely sociological terms is to forget that it was born not from human consensus, but from the pierced heart of Christ himself, who chose, who called, and who ordained according to his will alone. When he finished that thought, there was a pause, one that felt longer than silence, the kind of pause that holds both reverence and discomfort, for in that moment, Müller was not arguing against progress, but pleading for preservation, not defending privilege, but defending mystery. And as the camera lingered on his face, one could sense that what he sought was not victory in debate, but the survival of the sacred, the keeping of a promise made in the upper room and carried unbroken through centuries of saints and suffering. And so, as the interview drew to its close, there was a stillness in the room, a kind of reverence mingled with unease, as if everyone present understood that they had just heard not the opinions of a scholar, but the heartbeat of a church torn between two centuries, one anchored in eternal truth, and the other swept along by the restless tides of modernity. Cardinal Müller did not rise as a hero nor posture as a rebel. He simply allowed the truth to stand unvarnished before the world, as something older, holier, and far less negotiable than the world wishes it to be. In his final words, he spoke of a church that must decide whether she will continue to mirror the fashions of her age, or rediscover the timeless reflection of her bridegroom, and his voice carried the quiet sorrow of a shepherd who sees the smoke of confusion drifting even into the sanctuary, yet refuses to abandon his post. He reminded those listening that the Latin Mass, that ancient song of worship whispered through the centuries, is not an aesthetic preference, but a living inheritance, a visible continuity of faith that reaches back through generations to the very heart of Calvary, and to treat it as expendable is to amputate memory itself. He said that the Church's task is not to reinvent herself with every cultural storm, but to remain the still point in a turning world, to proclaim with calm conviction that the truth is not invented by man, but received from God. There was a quiet fire in his words when he warned that unity cannot be built by silencing one half of the faithful, nor can faith be renewed by forgetting what once made it strong. For every reform that forgets its roots becomes its own undoing. And yet, beneath all the sternness, there was a kind of compassion in him, a deep paternal ache for those who no longer recognize their own reflection in the church they love, and perhaps this was the most haunting part of all, that he spoke not as an accuser, but as a father calling his children home. He seemed to suggest that the church does not need more committees or documents or slogans, but hearts set aflame again by the same spirit that built her from the ashes of Rome, that fidelity, not innovation, is what will save her, and that the renewal so many seek will come, not through compromise, but through holiness. When the cameras stopped and the studio lights dimmed, his words did not fade. They lingered like the scent of incense after Mass, rising quietly into the night, carried by those who still believe that truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. And in that lingering silence, one could almost hear the echo of his warning that the church must choose not between old and new, but between truth and illusion, between the cross and comfort, between being the light of the world or its reflection. Because as Müller's eyes seemed to say, even when his lips fell silent, a church that ceases to guard the mystery ceases to be herself.